Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to another GameMaker tutorial. Now, today, we're going to do a quick tutorial on DS maps. Now, DS stands for data structure, so we're going to be talking about one of the many data structures that GameMaker has available in GameMaker language. We're going to simplify this and do a tic-tac-toe game that uses DS map. Now, this is actually one of the examples that I have in my GameMaker book that I'm working on. So if you want to check that out, there's a link in the description. But let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new sprite. And I'm just going to call this sprite char. And go to edit sprite. And we're going to add a new subimage right here and make this 160 by 160. Okay. Now come into this image and we're going to make this a giant circle because this is going to be the O in our tic-tac-toe game. So I'm just going to use this dark gray or something, make this a little bit thicker. And if you hold shift, this is a trick you might not know about. If you hold shift, it will force the circle to be a circle so you don't get ovals and stuff. Okay, there's our circle, but I actually don't want, let's see, we can use the wand to delete this. I didn't want the stuff on the inside, I just want the black on the outside. Just to make this a little bit more interesting, I'm going to go into image, outline, and this will put a red outline around our circle, and I'm going to do an outline of 2. And once you've done that, then you can actually paint the outline and make it a different color. And my opacity is down, so I need to put that up, but there you can paint the circle like that. Okay, now we're going to add another subimage with size of 160 by 160. Oops, I accidentally did a new one. So let's just copy this actually. Just do Control C, Control V. And we're going to select this and delete it. I actually left a little piece up here. And we're going to get the line tool and we're going to draw lines this time from both corners to make our X. And once again, if you hold shift, it will force this to do I don't even know what I'm trying to say. It'll force it to be angled like that, and it won't let you do anything in between. So let's add another outline. There we go, and we're going to paint it white. And I painted the wrong thing white. Sweet. Okay, we've got our O and we've got our X for our tic-tac-toe game. Leave the origin at 0, 0. Because we're just gonna, that makes it easier for the math that we're gonna be doing. Okay, now that we've got that done, let's create a new object. And I did not mean to click on timelines. So let's delete that. Create a new object and we'll call this object game because we're gonna actually hold our entire game object inside of this our entire game inside of this one object. So add an event, add a new create event, drag over execute a code. I'm going to put a comment in here that says create the DS. Did I say maps? I always say maps when I mean grid. I might have said maps. I apologize if earlier in the video I said that we were going to talk about DS maps because we're talking about DS grids. I'll probably do another video that talks about DS maps actually as well. So create the DS grid and initialize it. And initialize the game object. Okay. So we're going to create, so first of all, inside of our grid, each cell in the grid is going to hold a number. And each number will represent either an empty square, a circle, or an X inside of the grid. Now, we're going to define some rules here. So we're going to say a blank cell is going to be represented by a -1. Okay, an O is going to be represented by a 0, and an X is going to be represented by a 1. So those are just some rules that we defined, and part of the reason that I chose 0 and 1 here is because these correspond to the sub images in our sprite, 0 and 1. So that'll make it easy later. We can just set the sprite equal to the value that is inside our, we can set the sub image of our sprite equal to the value that's inside the grid. So now we're going to actually create our grid, and we're just going to store it in a variable called grid. Grid, that's a variable we're creating, equals ds grid create. Now this grid, because it's a tic-tac-toe grid, we only need it to be 3 cells wide and 3 cells high. Now we're going to use a cool function that comes with DS grids called DS grid set region, if I can spell it. Now the first argument that we pass into this function is the grid that we want to use. So we're going to just pass in grid, which is the grid that we made. Now we need an x1, and we're just going to do 0, because that is the first cell, the first x cell in our grid. We're going to do 0, which is the first y cell in our grid. Then we're going to do 2, which is the last x cell in our grid, and 2, which is the last y cell in our grid. So if you imagine a tic-tac-toe board, right? And the very top left cell is cell 0, 0. The next one is 1, 0. The next one is 2, 0. And then we jump down and we get 0, 1, and etc. And it goes on until the bottom right corner is going to be cell 2, 2. So even though our grid has a width and a height of 3 cells, the cells start counting at 0, so that's why our last cells are both 2. We've got 2, 1, we've got 0, 1, and 2, and that's how we get 3 cells. Now the last argument is going to be the vowel that we want to set this region to. And we're just going to do -1, because -1 corresponds to a blank grid object, or grid cell. And we're done with the create event, so you can press the green check mark. And now what we're going to do is we're going to add let's see, what should we do first? Let's add a left pressed event, and this event will set O's in our grid. So mouse, excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cold, so my voice might sound just a little bit different. So I'm going to do mouse, global mouse, left pressed. Drag over a code. We're going to set an O. Okay. Now we need to get the grid cell number relative to the mouse's position on the screen. So we need to divide up the game room into grid cells, basically. Now the way we can do this is, let's create a couple local variables, var grid x, var grid y. Okay. Now we're going to set grid x equal to the mouse's, where'd my equal sign go? Equal to the mouse's x position, div 160. So the div operator takes two operands and it returns whatever the answer is of this divided by this without a remainder. It returns a whole number without a remainder. So if we divide by 160 and our mouse's x position is less than 160, this is going to be 0. If our mouse's position is greater than 160 but less than two 160s, which is 320, then this value is going to be 1. Because we can only divide, if the value is 165, 160 will only go into 165 one time. If the value is, if you exclude the remainder. If the value is 319, 160 still only goes into 319 one time if you exclude the remainder. Now if it's 320, then it goes in 2 times, right? So that's how we're going to use our mouse's position on the screen and get a grid value inside of our grid data structure. So hopefully I explained that well, because it's kind of a tricky concept, but it allows you to divide up the screen into our grid. Let's do mouse y div 160. Now what we're going to do is we're going to set this grid cell that we have located. We're locating the grid cell right here to the value of 0, which represents an O. So let's do grid, and I'm going to use accessors in this. In my book, I actually don't. In my book, I use the real functions. But accessors are actually a new thing to GameMaker, and they're quite a bit better. So I would generally recommend using accessors. But in my book, I hadn't actually talked about them yet, so I didn't want to use them before talking about them. So we're going to do grid, and this kind of looks like an array bracket, but we're going to do a number sign here to tell GameMaker that this is a grid, and we're going to do grid x, which is the x position in our grid, and grid y, and then we can just set this equal to 0, and that will set the value of 0 onto the grid wherever our mouse is on the screen into that grid cell. So pretty cool. Now what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this event, right click on it, click duplicate, go to mouse, global mouse, and then do right pressed. So we're using left press to set an O. We're going to change this and do right press to set an X. So the only thing that we need to change here is we just change this to a 1, which sets an X instead of an O. Everything else should still work the same. Now what we need to do is our grid should work right now, but we won't be able to see the grid. So we need to make it so that we can see the grid. So add a new event, add a draw event, draw. And inside of here, we're going to do draw the grid. So so in order to draw this grid, we're going to have to loop through every single cell in the grid. And in order to loop through a two-dimensional grid, one way to do that, I should say, is to use 2 for loops with one nested inside of the other one. Because one for loop will loop through the columns, and the other one will loop through each row. So we're going to do for var, for parentheses var column equals 0, column is less than, let me group these a little better, it'll be easier to read. Column is less than ds grid width grid. So this just gets the width of our grid, which is 3, but if we do it this way, then we could change the size of our grid and this would still work. So that gets the width of our grid to make sure we don't go over. Column plus plus. Okay, so there's our first for loop that's going to loop through our columns. Actually, go through and change all these to rows. And change this to height. We're going to loop through our rows first. Okay, you could actually just copy this. Maybe it would have been smart to copy it before I changed it, and we'll change these all to column now. And this to width again. Column. Okay. And there's our second for loop. So this one loops through our rows. This one loops through our columns inside of the row loop. And because it's inside of it, we can touch every single cell inside of our grid. Now, we're going to check what the value of our grid element or our grid cell is that we're currently on. So let's do if grid, and I'm going to use accessors again. Grid, and the first one is the X position, which is actually going to be our column. And the second one's going to be our row. Okay, because each X position, each new X position is actually a new column, while each new Y position is a new row. And we're going to check to see if this is equal to -1. Why? Because that means if it is equal to -1, then this means that we're on an empty square. So what do we want to do if we're on an empty square? We want to just continue through the loop and not do anything else. So you can use the continue statement. And this is kind of like a break statement, where a break statement will break out of a loop. But this actually just basically says skip this iteration, skip to the next one. Because we're an empty one, so we'll just skip. Okay, after our if statement, we're going to do var sub image equals grid accessor column row. So this is going to get the value of our grid, and we're storing it in a local variable called sub image, because that's what we actually stored in the grid, right? Was sub images, 0 for O's and 1 for X's, because that's how it is in here. Okay, once we've done that, we can draw a sprite. Draw sprite char, which is the sprite we had, sub image, because we just found that. Now we're going to do column times 160 and row times 160. Now what this does is it draws, so if column is 0 and row is 0, then it's going to draw our sprite at 0, 0. But if column is 1 and row is 1, then it's going to draw our sprite at 160 and 160, which is going to be the middle of the room. So multiplying it by 160 this just converts our grid coordinates into game room coordinates, right? Because remember when we converted from game room coordinates, the mouse position, we used the div operator, which divides by 160, So we're just doing the opposite to convert back. Now what we need to do is, one thing that I forgot to do was create a background. Create a new background, call this BG, I don't know, tile. That works, BG tile. And make this 160 by 160. And I'm just gonna do a black square like this. And get rid of the center. Just a black square around the outside. Okay. Now let's create a room. And I'm just going to call this rm_room. And our width is going to be 480 and our height is going to be 480. And if you click on the backgrounds tab, you can select visible when room starts and select our background tile. And since tile horizontally and tile vertically are selected, it will automatically tile it and make our tic-tac-toe grid. Now we can go to our objects and click on the object game and place it in the room. Now we should be able to save and run this game, which uses our grids data structure to build a simple tic-tac-toe game. Now let's make sure this actually works. Okay, so if I right click, I create a X. If I left click, I create a circle. And as you can see, I can actually change them from what they were before. So if you're playing your friend, you can just tell them to look the other way and then hurry and change it and win. But this is how grids work. Grids are really, really useful because you can store data inside of a grid and then manipulate that data later. A neat trick that I want to show you really quick before we finish is if you're using something inside of GameMaker and you're not quite exactly sure all the different things you can do with it, you can middle click on any function. So this function right here, ds grid set region, I'm going to middle click on that and it'll pop up with the help file explaining that. So you can see here where it has a image of it setting a region inside of a grid and setting them all to 1. Another thing you can do is if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see this back to DS grids. You can click on that and look at all these different functions that we have from grids. There's so many different things you can do with grids. You can sort them, you can shuffle them, you can set regions. You can, it looks like you can get minimum values of a certain section or maximum values. They're really, really useful. There's quite a bit more that you can do with grids than what you could do easily with a two-dimensional array. Even though they're kind of similar, there's some added stuff that you get with DS grids. So thank you guys very much for watching this video. Don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. And if you want to check out my GameMaker book, you can check out that link in the description. I actually have a free sample download up on my website. You can kind of see what it's like. I'm still writing it, but I'm releasing the early access version, the kind of a rough draft version, to everyone who pre-orders it. So once you pre-order it, I send you that rough draft version and you can kind of get an idea of what it's like. It's getting pretty big. I'm at like 140 something pages, I think, now. So, but thank you guys so much for watching, and I will talk to you guys later.